Today we welcome Dr. David Rousseau of the Political Science Department. Professor Rousseau's research interests focus on military conflict, shared identity, political development, and foreign policy. His first book, Democracy and War, examines the relationship between institutional structures and political norms within international disputes. His second book, Identifying Threats and Threatening Identities, explores the impact of shared identity on threat perception. In addition to his book publications, Professor Rousseau has published numerous articles, book chapters, and conference papers. He received his MPP from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. And you have a new book that will be coming out next year?
Hopefully.
Yeah. And his presentation today is War and Rights, the Impact of War on Political and Civil Rights. Please welcome Professor Rousseau.
So I'm just going to talk for about 25 minutes or so and give you an overview of the book project that is due back to the publisher on January 15th, which I will have a very long and tiring holiday break if I'm going to make that deadline, but I will do my best. So the key question in the book is, how does war affect political rights? And there's lots of different schools of thought about this. I think the one that's sort of most familiar to us all is the Garrison State hypothesis, which basically says you should see a decline in political and civil rights when war happens. States tend to crack down because they want to have an efficient mobilization. They don't want to deal with any opposition. So we see things like censorship happen. The middle image are Japanese Americans during World War II, 100,000 of them, many of them second generation born in the United States, rounded up from the West Coast and put into camps throughout the United States. But it's not just the United States. The picture on your far right is from Canada, and during World War I they rounded up enemy aliens at the start of the war, but they also rounded up tens of thousands of people from mostly Austria-Hungary, so Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians, for simply not having a job because they were fired at the start of the war because nobody wanted a Hungarian working in the mine or the paper plant, etc. And if you were unemployed from an enemy combatant state, you were put into these camps all over Canada. They were sent up, build roads into Banff and do all sorts of physical labor in very, very stressful areas. I have an image of the Patriot Act. Obviously after 9/11 there was great debate within our country about how much civil rights should be limited for the war on terror. The school of thought that's probably not as familiar to you is what they call the extraction school in the literature. And it comes from the idea that when you start a war, you often have a rally around the flag effect, that everyone rallies to the government to support the war effort when the out-group is attacking the in-group. But as war progresses, and as more and more is demanded from society, whether or not it's sons and fathers going off to fight, family members working in defense factories, taxes, etc., unrest begins to rise in societies. And at some point the government has to do something to dampen that. They often try to use economic incentives. The middle photo comes from the United States during World War II. African Americans under the leadership of Philip Randolph were going to march on Washington because they wanted access to defense sector jobs and access to federal jobs, which had been barred to blacks for decades. And eventually the march was canceled because Roosevelt gave in and opened up those sectors, and black employment rose dramatically in those areas. And the final image on the far right is from the Representation of the People's Act in Great Britain during World War I. Britain enters the war with no conscription, but they run out of soldiers by 1917 and they face a crisis. And as they debate the Conscription Act, they decide they have to give soldiers the right to vote if they're going to send them off to die. Obviously, at the same time, the suffrage movement had been strong in Britain, and they rolled women and men into the same bill because in a total war of the First World War, they thought contributing in the factory was just as important as contributing on the battlefield. So in all these cases, what we see is as you have a long war, you need to extract resources, human and financial, and you're giving rights for that. So my work is trying to combine these two schools of thought, and the way I think about it is different types or levels of threats and mobilization. And so if you have a low threat, low mobilization, you're likely to see a little bit of the Garrison State hypothesis, some restriction on rights, but not too severe. If you end up with a high threat but low mobilization, you're going to restrict rights a lot in the society. And the final case is if you have to mobilize, you'll see a countervailing force in which people will start demanding civil and political rights in order to keep contributing to the effort. And I should emphasize that high mobilization is actually very, very rare. There's only 122 cases in which we've mobilized over 5% of the population for war. The United States has only done it in an interstate war 3 times, 43, 44, and 45. So it takes a lot of mobilization in order for this to happen. And you can think of World War I, World War II, but also in other situations we see it go above that 5% threshold. So the book, I won't bore you with the whole book. There's several chapters in it, both sort of modern, more recent, and more historical. I'll focus just on 3. I'll take it through sort of the story about Austria-Hungary during World War I, a little segment on African Americans serving in World War II as part of Chapter 5, and finally just a little bit on the experience of Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. So begin with Austria-Hungary. If I had a time machine, I would go back in time and go to Austria-Hungary. It is, I think, one of the most interesting places in the world. After Austria-Hungary lost to Prussia on the battlefield in 1866, they had a constitutional crisis, and they reformed the institutional structure and split the empire into 2 halves. The emperor was in charge of both, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, but the Austrian side of the empire, which you see in the pink, and also the Dalmatian is also part of it. I don't know why the color's off. And so Austria side has its own parliament, has its own government. Most everything is delegated to the state level here. So the imperial forces control the military, foreign policy, and resources. And so the Ministry of Finance. But everything else is decentralized. Hungary is in green. Hungary is a much more repressive place. They don't allow most of the Slovaks or the Croats, who are part of the Hungarian side of the empire, to have many rights overall. So Austria-Hungary comes into the war pretty autocratic, less so on the Austrian side, more so on the Hungarian side. The image on the right there shows the diversity of the languages spoken, and so you get a sense of how diverse this place is. So the red is the German speaking areas, including what is Austria and the Sudetenland. We see the Slovaks in blue, the Czechs in blue, the Slovaks in brown. The purple are Poles, the yellow are Ukrainians, the red or the oranges are in Transylvania are Romanians, Hungarians in green, Slovenians in gray, and Slavs in Croatia and Bosnia. So a very, very diverse place. And in question and answer, we can talk about how does a place like that mobilize a military to fight in World War I. And it's fascinating how they managed to do it. But the ethnic diversity is going to create great pressure, even before the war, for these different nationalities to get the amount of representation and control. So for example, in the Ukrainian area, what is the language of instruction in universities? Right? Is it German? The Poles wanted to be Polish. The Ukrainians wanted to be Ukrainian. These are mixed populations, and so there's great battles about who should control. A lot of pressure to decentralize, as happened in 1867, and in areas where you have overlapping populations, that's where the conflict occurs. And so you see Poles and Ukrainians fighting it out. It's not, although it looks like it's homogeneous, you can see little overlaps in some of the language areas. So World War I, we all know the story of the Archduke getting assassinated, the demands put on Serbia by Austria-Hungary, the invasion of Serbia, and eventually bringing in all great power. So the Russians come to support their Serbian brethren, the Germans support Austria-Hungary, and France comes in to support Russia. Eventually the Germans march through Belgium, which brings Britain into the war. And so Austria-Hungary, after 1915, when Italy comes into the side of the Entente is actually fighting a three-front war. It has troops fighting along the Russian border, it has troops fighting along Serbia and in Serbia, and along the Italian border. And eventually they attack and defeat Romania with the assistance of German troops. So this is a war in which is going to put tremendous pressure on this very diverse empire. At the start of the war, we see a huge reduction in civil and political liberties. A lot of this was pre-planned, that they had put in place legislation that said we will declare an emergency. An emergency means we will do A, B, C, and D. And they did that during the July crisis. Actually, before the war was actually declared, both sides of the empire declared an emergency, and it shifted powers drastically. So the Austrian parliament, for example, which had been gone out of session in the spring, was not allowed to come back. And so basically all the legislative arm of the empire suspended on the Austrian side, not the Hungarian side. Censorship is created, so they immediately created the War Surveillance Office, the commission on the Hungarian side, and everything was looked at. So newspapers were closed, those that were allowed to remain open had a censor that read the whole thing before it went to print every single day. All telegraphs, telephones, all letters. It's amazing. They would review every single letter that was sent. And so they have an office and they're just Xing out with black ink, postcards, letters, etc. So a tremendous amount of censorship. In the military zones, all administrative authority is turned over to the military, and that includes huge parts of Austria, side of the empire, as well as down in Bosnia. And that meant that the military made all decisions. There's no civilian control left. The military did things like got rid of all the Ukrainians in civilian control in areas because they were seen as unreliable. The military controlled the court system. It moved to an adversarial system, and in certain areas like disturbing the peace, it's not like disturbing the peace in the US, but interfering with the war effort. Those trials would take place with just military officers. You had only two outcomes. You're either convicted or you're innocent, and if you're convicted, you're executed within 2 hours. So in these military zones, which again, when you're fighting on three fronts, this is a huge part of the country, are very, very troublesome. Mass internment happened, so immediately they decide to intern enemy aliens. So if I'm an Italian citizen hanging out in Trieste, I'm going to go into a camp. But they decide that Italian speakers are suspect. So I'm a citizen of the country, but I happen to speak Italian because I live in an area of historically Italian ethnic. Then I'm put into a camp. And so they put tens of thousands of people, almost 100,000+ Ukrainians go in. 25,000 Ukrainians are either executed in the camps or die during the camps of starvation, disease, etc. So that's 25,000 who are dead, right? So the numbers that were taken out are enormous. And finally, they imprisoned ethnic leaders. All the Czech leaders end up in prison in 1915 after trials of treason. They actually don't execute them as originally planned, but they are imprisoned going forward. So again, a fairly autocratic state becomes hyper-autocratic at the start of the conflict. Over the course of 1915 and 1916, tremendous pressure is put on this country, and it comes from both the hunger and the deaths. On the death side, the war is using up all the adult males in society. So the country has 54 million people, 7.8 are mobilized for the war effort. And at first glance, that doesn't seem very big, right? But half of the 54 are women, right? Then take all the children out of that. Then take all males over 50 out of that. What it means is we're talking 80+% of males are in. Even people rejected for the war in 1914. By 1915 and 16, you have a limp and you can hardly walk. Too bad, you're in the military now. We'll use you somewhere, maybe not on the front line, but you can do something. 1.2 million killed, 3.6 million wounded. Several of those people are wounded multiple times. 2.2 end up in POW camps. So by 1916, there's really nobody left, right? They want to do another call-up, and they're talking, they just have a few thousand people left, 50,000 left or so. And also remember, it's front-loaded. So a lot of the casualties are happening in the first year and a half of the war. In the first 6 months, from August to December, 1 million casualties. So this is an army of 900,000 that enters a war thinking it's going to end by Christmas, and 900,000 people are wounded, dead, or captured. So their whole entire army's gone. So then they start drafting more and bringing it in. And it's a very difficult situation. Virtually all the junior officers are dead. They're all bilingual, right? So they speak Hungarian and German and Croat and German, and they're all dead. And so try to run an army where the key links between your different units are dead. It's remarkable that things didn't fall apart quickly. On the civilian side, hunger is really going to become a huge problem. So I have two sets of data. The first two columns are when they put rationing in effect in 1915. So pre-war is about 30% more calories. It drops by 30 by 1915. And even the rationing doesn't work because people are lining up all night in order to get things, and often you just can't get any of the rationed goods. But by 1918, they're down to 830 calories. Now, people can't survive on 830 calories very long, right? So, I mean, we all know a male is supposed to have 2,000 calories a day on average. So, to give you a sense, people are starving throughout, particularly the Austrian side. Hungary has a lot more agriculture, and so they have been able to keep some of that. In 1918, 7 to 11% of all women in Vienna are dying of starvation, just straight out starving to death. Another 20 to 30% are dying of diseases that if they were healthy, they could have survived. And so we're talking in the 30 to 40% of women in the capital city of the empire starving to death. So what's happening out in the periphery? It's a crisis. So as this crisis is brewing, what happens is change is very slow coming until the Emperor Franz Joseph dies in November of 1916. And when he dies, Karl takes over. Originally, Karl's inclination is to side with his German colleagues and push the garrison state even farther. Repress the minorities more, use decrees to reform parliament, make German the language, chief language in the Austrian side. But he fears that the whole country is going to collapse. He wants to sign a peace with the Allies. He thinks if I repress the Allies anymore, minorities anymore, it could lead to no peace and the collapse. So he begins doing what the extraction school predicts. He opens parliament in the Austrian side, brings back, makes political parties legal. They can talk. They're not going to be sent to jail for questioning the war effort. Censorship is released outside of the immediate war zones. Military control is limited. They go back to civilian trials. The camps are largely closed, and so all these questionable loyalty Italians I was talking about before are allowed to leave. Amnesty is granted for political prisoners, including all the leaders of the Czech groups that were in power. The Hungarian side, it resists all of these changes because Hungary wants to keep its privileged position on its side of the empire, does not want Slavs to have any sort of power to question it. Eventually, the king removes the prime minister, and the key issue that he got removed from, which fits perfectly with the argument, the emperor says you've got to give voting rights to more people in the Hungarian side, particularly soldiers who serve, because I want them to keep fighting. And the Hungarian prime minister says, no, I'm not going to do it, and the emperor removes him for resisting. We don't know really what would have happened in Austria-Hungary if the war had ended in 1917 or hadn't been as severe. It ends up here getting broken up into several different states, and so it's a partial story. We see the liberalization, but eventually the liberalization is not speedy enough to save the empire from disintegrating. So my second case comes from the United States, and the chapter covers African Americans throughout American history. They fought in the Revolution, in the Civil War, World War I, but I'm just going to focus in on World War II. So in World War II, it's going into the war, there is actually an Army rule that says you are not allowed to do surveys in the Army. Which seems strange to our ears, and it was because they didn't want to hear any bad news. They didn't want to publish that soldiers weren't happy with the food and the rest of it. But General Marshall, under the prodding of Samuel Stouffer here, an academic from the University of Wisconsin, says, we got to figure out how to improve morale, and the only way we do that is with surveys. And he sets up the research branch, which is a fascinating group of people. And they do, survey research is making progress in the 1930s, so they know how to do random probability samples, but they do fantastic stuff with the most primitive of equipment. They have a tabulator, and so if in question and answer I can talk a little bit, but like on my computer when I'm in Stata, I can just type sort the data. They sorted the data by having wooden things with pegs in them, flipping them over, and all sorts of crazy stuff. And the fact that they were able to do 500,000 surveys, both in combat zones and out, is really quite amazing. The survey I'm going to focus in on is done in 1943. The sample I'm going to focus in are black soldiers, not the supplemental, which include better educated, but just the random sample of black soldiers overall. They asked them about their rights and what they thought about rights, which for me is fascinating, right? Because here you're getting the first person account. Do I think I'm going to get rights from fighting in a war? Not just what historians think about your rights. The first one is about what's the best strategy. And this was a great debate. If you're a minority group with limited rights, do you fight while the crisis is going on and extract concessions then, right? So if you're the Irish, do you rebel during the First World War because Britain's pressed the wall and they might make concessions? Or are you a loyal citizen? So you fight and do well and get rewarded after. And communities are split on this, as you can see. A majority think you should do both at the same time. And African American leaders and the papers in 1914 called this the double V strategy. Victory at home, victory abroad. And what you see here is 36% of African American soldiers want to move with that, but a significant number, about a third in either, are split about what they should do. The second question is about, do you think you personally will get more rights? And again, this comes out of that tradition that often soldiers, people who fought, got rights during or after wars, right? And that wasn't extended to males who didn't fight or females. And so here, 43% say they think they're going to get rights. But more interesting to me is do you think your community as a whole is going to get more rights? So is your sacrifice on the battlefield going to lead to African Americans overall getting more rights? And again, 43% say yes. I don't expect you to read this, but I'll tell you three highlights. One is a lot of research thinks or thought that you would have these extrinsic factors would be important. So if you came from the North and you're an African American, you would have certain beliefs about the world that made you a good soldier and a more motivated soldier. Or if you were an officer, or you volunteered, or you're older, or these sort of things. And I find, in fact, in terms of expectations for rights, that doesn't actually matter, with the exception of people who serve in combat units. Most African Americans during both world wars were in combat service support or labor units, not combat units. But the ones who are in combat units, those people do think that their sacrifice is going to be rewarded, which is, I think, interesting and fits the pattern of the greater sacrifice should be rewarded. But actually, most of the people who think they should have more rights are people who find the Army an opportunity for them to do well. So the questions ask things like, are you having a good time in the Army? Are you proud of your unit? Does the Army give you a chance to succeed? Are you interested in the job you have in the Army? And so these are things in which the Army, the experience within the Army, is motivating the soldiers to believe that this institution is good for them. It's a racist institution, right? So segregation across the board. A lot of, I could go on and on about Southern officers leading and the brutal existence. However, compared to other society where you came from, the Army in many ways seemed more open to them, more of a meritocracy than they had experienced out in the civilian life. And so it's that experience of the Army which leads these people to believe we can have more rights. I'll just also give you three questions that are in the survey that I find fascinating. That is, what do they think about segregation in the military? And so the first question asks, do you think segregated PXs are a good idea? And those are the bases, stores on a base, right? You go into a PX to buy shampoo and cigarettes and that sort of thing. And 47% say segregated is bad. And so PXs are a very impersonal place. You don't interact with other people buying stuff. So a typical base had a good white PX and a terrible black PX, if one existed at all. So they want to be in that had the goods that they wanted to buy. If you ask them about service clubs, where all the bases have service clubs where you shoot pool, drink beer, dances are there, etc., it flips. Because they're sick, these black soldiers are sick of going into a dance, asking a white woman to dance, and getting in a fight, and having the whole dance canceled, right? These are things that happen over and over, both on US bases and when they're deployed. And so for the service club, they want to be segregated. And what's fascinating to me is, do you think your units should be segregated? And so it's a little unclear what they thought of units. Did they think of it as a company, for example? But a slight majority wants segregated units and thinks they can do better that way. And what's interesting is when you get a sense of looking at this data, none of these people have any idea that within about a decade, the US Army is going to be completely integrated. The whites are like 90% don't want integrated units. The blacks are split evenly. And by 1954, Truman does the Executive Act in 48, but it takes until 54 to integrate the last unit in the US military. So I don't think anybody expected that to happen, and many didn't want it, even on this African American side. So how am I doing on time? As I have a couple more minutes? Okay. The last case I'll just highlight is the Iran-Iraq War and Iraq's position within it. We chose a case because A, it's modern, and B, everyone thinks Saddam Hussein is, the most ruthless dictator of all time and has no rights to the country going into the war. So how could, you get worse, or how could you extract anything from him? The Shah obviously leads until 1979 after the revolution. The revolution triggers purges within the civilian and the military. And Iraq and Iran have a long-standing territorial dispute along the Shat al-Arab waterways. So down here, 1975, they signed a treaty that's very one-sided in Iran's side. And so Saddam Hussein says, hey, you guys are in domestic turmoil. I'm going to take advantage of this, start a war, grab a little bit of territory, make concessions. It'll be a short war, everything will go smoothly. It doesn't turn out that way. Iraq, as you know, as everyone knows now, is a very diverse place. The Kurds dominate up in the north, the Sunni in the middle, the Shiites in the south, in the green area there. But again, many of the challenges that Austria-Hungary have, Iraq has. The war turns out to be probably the most brutal war after World War II. Iraq has a population of 13 million. They end up mobilizing 1.5 million people, which is a tremendous number. About 180,000 to 500,000, depending on the source you read. Deaths, making it one of the most deadly wars after World War II. Starts out in Iraq, does the grab, waiting for the Iranians to concede and come to the negotiating table. Iran, in phase 2, takes that territory back, and then you have a multi-year stalemate. And that's when the mobilization happens. They start running out of troops, out of money. They have to figure out ways in which to keep this war going. And then it turns out, in the last year of the war, Iran is exhausted from these human waves, attacks. They have virtually no tanks, no aircraft left, and Iraq is able to use maneuver warfare for the first time since 1980, and ends up forcing Iran to the bargaining table. So as you expect, it's a very authoritarian place, so very limited rights to begin with, but it gets worse for several groups of people. And so the first are the Shia of Iranian origin. So I guess I'll backtrack here. Iran is about 60% Shia, 45% are the Arab Shia, and 15% are Persian Shia or Shia of Iranian origin. And so these are people who had migrated from Iran at some point, became citizens. And it's a fascinating story when in 1922, they ended up, if you were of Iranian Iranian Shia, your national, what do they call it? The certificate of nationality has a stamp on it. You're labeled a B. And nobody really thought about that at the time. But Saddam Hussein uses that B stamp that was created, because your children have to have the same stamp as you, regardless of where they're born. And so he uses that to decide who's going to be in the loyal in group, and those are the Arab Shia, and the disloyal out group are the Shia of Persian origin. And so he begins to liquidate them. Males in particular disappear, but all females and families are either put in camps or deported. They have programs such as if you're a soldier, you divorce your wife and she gets kicked out of the, if she's of Iranian origin, she gets kicked out of the country and you get 5,000 dinar. Right? So they're just getting rid of, breaking up families, getting rid of all the Shia of Iranian origin. Security services clamp down even more. The imams traditionally were independent, Shia imam. They now become state employees. They get a paycheck, and in exchange for the paycheck, they have censorship of all their sermons going forward. But we also see, as the war drags on, some indication of greater rights. And so the Arab Shias are the ones who are celebrated. So they are heroes. They name weapon systems after historical characters. They start promoting. The war starts, there's almost no Shia officers in the army. So Shia make up the majority of soldiers, foot soldiers, but almost no officers. By the end of the war, maybe 25% of the officers are Shia at this point. So a big change. They open an assembly in 1984 and reserve 40% of the seats for Shia. Now critics are going to say, well, it's a dictatorship. The assembly doesn't do much. But it discusses healthcare, discusses housing. So the Shia are having a voice. They're a majority of people in the country, and for the first time they have some voice in shaping these policies that are not going to challenge the leadership. They're also going to be put in different positions within leadership, and so several members of the Regional Command Council are now Shia for the first time, and economic benefits go to the Shia as well. The Kurds are the second group that are there. Kurds are less necessary, right? Because there's a lot of Shia, right? 60%. Kurds are only 15%. But still, Saddam Hussein believes he needs those 15%. Originally, when the war starts, basically all troops are taken to the south to fight Iran, and the Kurds are on their own. And the Kurds are fighting amongst themselves a great deal, as happens throughout Kurdish history. But then Saddam Hussein needs to negotiate. And he starts negotiating, what do you want? And they wanted autonomy, and they also wanted oil revenues. They've wanted these things forever and never had been able to make progress. In around 1985, Saddam Hussein decides he's going to give those two things in exchange for getting the Kurds to fight outside of the Kurdish regions. And he's just about to do it, and Turkey comes in, and Turkey says, Saddam Hussein, you have one oil pipeline left. It all goes through Turkey. We are not going to tolerate autonomous Kurds on our border creating problems for Turkey. And so if you do that, no oil revenue, your war's in deep trouble. And Saddam Hussein backs down. And when he backs down, the two Kurdish groups join forces together and declare war on the Iraqi government, because at this point they don't think they can negotiate it. They're going to fight their way to freedom, and ends up being attacked, use of chemical weapons. 500 to 100,000 Kurds are killed in the next 2 years, extensively through gas attacks on them. So, sum up, I think the two sort of standard theories, garrison state and extraction, don't tell the whole story, that in fact they could both be in operation just at different points of the story. So always see the garrison state at the start of the war. If mobilization takes place, if it forces you to make concessions, you'll often give political rights to minorities during or after the war. It happens in places that are very different, right? So it seems to be happening in places like the United States and Austria, Hungary, and Iraq. And finally, just a point that the wars you don't want to get into are those that have a high sense of threat and low mobilization, because that's when you get rid of rights, but there's no contrary. And the question for the war on terror is it an intense threat or not? Certainly after 9/11, it seemed very intense for many Americans, in which they were willing to allow things like torture and rendition, allow the Patriot Act to sail through. As the war is going on, we all know there will be no end to the war on terror, because terror will never go away. And so if the intensity of the threat goes down, will people begin to rethink those things? And we have seen that in terms of the enhanced interrogation, torture, and a little bit of rendition, but not much. With that, I'll open it up for questions. Yeah?
You said you could tell us more about the Army's tabulator, so I hope you could do that.
Okay. So it's just fascinating that they were doing so much with such limited technology. And so for a lot of the survey questions, they wanted to rank order things. And so they'd ask like 10 questions and see, are you high on all of them? Or who's high on 9 of them? Who's high on 8 of them? And so the only way they could figure out how to do that, because the tabulators would just add stuff up, right? So the way they did it is they created these boards, 100 pegs by 100 rows by columns, and they had sort of a thin piece of wood that slid into each like lat, right? And they all have holes in it. And so they would then, if you answered a question, they would put like a BB into the hole and fill in the board so they'd have everybody's answers. And then they take a board with the things going the other way, and they put it on top of it, flip it over, and then they could sort the louvers, right? So you could keep sorting all the time. But now, right, if you're in SPSS or Stata, you just type sort, right? So some of these surveys have 1,500 people, right? And so imagine how many 100 by 100 boards you're doing to sort these questions in order to get these rank orders. And these people are just ingenious about how they did it. And it's just fascinating to see all the sort of important changes they went through and really thoughtful. A lot of the people who served in the research branch come out and sort of Newark and Chicago and other places, these survey research centers after World War II, are people who were trained in these operations, so they became experts on doing surveys. And so it's just a fascinating group of people, and the barriers that they had and the inventive solutions that they came up with are just crazy to me.
And when were they, if I may ask, when were they conducting the surveys? I mean, because combat troops, and were they doing it when they were stateside? Were they doing it when they were on the front lines?
So it forms in 1940. They do their first survey the day after Pearl Harbor, not because of Pearl Harbor, it just had been planned. And they do most of the surveys, particularly the early ones, are in continental US. The data I showed you for blacks is continental US. But they do fronts as well, and so they're going into the front. They can't go on a battle line, but they rotate troops back from the front for rest and relaxation and sort of recharging their batteries, and they would interview those people at the time. And so it was a pretty amazing operation, and you needed General Marshall behind you because they would do this random sample and they say, okay, we're going to the 4th Air Force, and we're going to choose this regiment and this company, and then we'll have a list of the company members, and then we'll randomly choose the company members. And they'll show up at this Air Force base, and the Air Force general is like, nah, we're not going to do that. And so they call General Marshall, and General Marshall's office calls back and says, yes, you are going to do that. But again, most of them are in continental US. The US, again, 43, you have to think about it. So we declare war in 41. 42, we have almost nobody overseas at that point. And so we have huge numbers in the United States. It's just 43, some in 42, but not the huge numbers that we see going over for 43. So by 44, if you're not doing troops overseas, you're going to get a pretty biased sample. Less so in 40. 42 should be good. 43, a little bit of a mix. And by 44, yeah, we need to be overseas. And so I think when you look at, when I looked at where they're doing them later in the war, they are overseas more. And they use it for all sorts of reasons. I mean, the key thing is they want to know who's going to break in the battlefield. So who's going to run and who's going to follow orders. And so it's that motivation. But they also do things, all sorts of interesting things. So demobilization is always controversial because standard way of, I have the 10th Army Division and it's 1944. I have a bunch of people who've been serving in that for 4 years and they survived. But I also have some people that are there only 2 weeks, right? Because they're replacements and people in between. So the traditional way was just demobilize divisions. But that is, if I'm in a different unit, I've been fighting for 4 years and somebody who's been there for 2 weeks gets off, that makes me really upset. And so they use the surveys to decide what the soldiers thought would fare. And so they demobilize not at a division level, but a smaller unit to make sure that each unit then, I don't know if they did it at the company level or not, I'd have to check, but each unit was sort of how many years of service is in this unit on the front. And then you got a certain designation and the probability that you were demobilized went up. So again, it is a morale question. And so it fits in with the overall idea, but and interesting how this was actually used in practice. The other thing interesting here is 43 is the peak year in which blacks and white soldiers are fighting, and we have on U.S. military-based training bases, people are shooting at each other in several incidences, and so they're trying to figure out how do we decrease this conflict. And the Army, over the course of the war, is implementing lots of things. Like on many bases, you have a black theater and a white theater. After a while, after 43, the Army says, no, we're not doing that anymore. And it takes a while. Some base commanders refuse to close it down, et cetera, but they're not supporting any longer the building of two. So even during the war, the Army's starting to make some changes. Yeah?
David, you mentioned the garrison state, the anti-extraction theories of rights. Are there others, other theories of this?
So there's several others. There's some that think, and this is actually a very popular one, that war doesn't matter at all. And the longue durée school is that, people are going to get rights eventually in the UK, both males without property and women, because we're just seeing the economic development, and it's just a matter of time before it happened. And certainly there are those broader social forces at work. But if you look at the debate in the House of Commons in 1917, it's all about the war. It happens in that year because of the war. And one of the most interesting things is there's a great debate about conscientious objectors. And a lot of the British members of Parliament are like, no way are they ever getting the right to vote. And then there's this huge debate at one point where, what if you're the wife of a conscientious objector? So your husband's a coward, but should you not get the right to vote because your husband's a coward? So again, it's all about the war and who's contributing to the war effort. And so again, what I see it as these long sort of forces are pushing things in a certain direction, but the immediate cause of why did it take place in 1917 versus 1929, I think the war has a big impact on it. Yeah.
Hey, David.
How are you?
Good, thanks. So I think it's really interesting. I want to know what the reasoning is behind not allowing soldiers to vote. You made a comment very early on in 1918 in Britain that soldiers or men in combat, I'm not sure the expression you used, they didn't have the vote. And so what was the reason behind that?
Why they didn't have the vote?
Yeah.
So in Britain, there were restrictions for property rights and other things, and so there were educational restrictions at some time. Lots of societies have lots of restrictions. So basically, white males with property get the right to vote, and then slowly, you don't have education restriction, you don't have property or wealth restriction, et cetera. And so they start pulling those things away. And so it's getting to the point in, Britain has reforms in 1832, and others, but in 1917, that reform gives more males the right to vote than all the other reforms. So it's a big deal, and it's property for them primarily. Britain's a little weird. Like if you went to Oxford, you got 2 votes and stuff like that, and so all sorts of weird things exist. In the case of Hungary, the Hungarians are about, I forget what percentage, but it's well under 50% of the population, maybe on their side of the empire, maybe 40%. What the Hungarians didn't want was to give all the Slavs, so the Croats and others, the right to vote, the Poles, et cetera, because if they all got together, they would have 55% of the vote, and they could get outvoted in parliament in the Hungarian side. And so the Hungarians are doing all sorts of things to force the Hungarian language on Ukrainians, right? Because they just basically want to make everyone Hungarians. And so those measures will fail if you start giving votes to these individuals. So for Hungary's case, they want to be able to control their side of the empire. And right now, they're able to do it. Germany is very different. Germany, if you add the Slovaks and Czechs and Poles together, they outnumber the Germans already. So the Germans have already faced this. We're going to be a minority and we can get outvoted. The Hungarians haven't faced that yet because their minorities are much smaller, and they were hell-bent on making sure that they couldn't be outvoted by the Slavs. Other questions? Yeah, Trudy.
Were there women involved in that research effort?
Yeah. A lot of women. Some of them went on to do work at these institutes, and it's not a huge organization, and the women tended to work at the headquarters branch. I didn't get a sense from doing the research whether or not they went out collected the data or they were just working doing the statistic stuff, etc. But there's certainly several women there who then went on to the academic and commercial world. And again, the data itself, so when they sent people out, they weren't collecting all the data, so they would go, and for the African Americans, they would go bring the survey instruments there, and they would have, for the African Americans, a huge percentage are illiterate of the African Americans, and so they would have non-commissioned African American officers do orally to the enlisted people to take the survey. And there's complications there, right, because obviously you have an officer sitting in front of you and that might alter your views. On the other hand, if somebody's illiterate, what can you do? Whites also have illiterate, and for those, most of them were given it pencil and paper in this survey that I referred to, and the illiterate ones then were given to it by non-commissioned officers as well. Yeah.
Could you talk about your research project process a little bit? Like, did you have to travel or go to archives and Austria?
So. Not too much. Some of my authors did. So the Russian chapter is written by a former student of mine, where we co-author it, and he did go to some archives. I went actually to the National Archives to try and see what was there for these surveys. I was hoping, I knew it was very unlikely, that they had the original survey. So, and the open-ended questions, they took notes on paper, and then they created quantitative things that are in the database now. But I was interested in, what is that non-commissioned black officer taking notes on it? How did then they interpret those notes? It would have been fascinating to have. Turns out they have one of each survey in there with handwritten stuff about how they coded it, but they don't have the actual responses to it. So after looking through 32 boxes of all sorts of stuff, I could not find even a single case in which we saw the respondents, which makes perfect sense, right? The war's ending, you're closing the shop down, you've already aggregated the data, throw the originals out, and so there's tons of correspondence like between the camps and people, that sort of thing, but not too much. So, so not much archival work overall. And in terms of my process, a lot of the papers were written, actually started a while ago with my doctoral students, 4 of them, and we presented them as conferences, and then I went into administration for a little while, and they sat in drawers, and then when I stepped down, I dusted them off while I was on sabbatical, and then we've been revising them. The African American chapter is new because I just found that data about a year ago, and yeah, it's one of these things that's just been sitting in. The author, Stouffer, brought it to him when he moved to Harvard, kept it with him until he died, and then it went into a Roper where it was stored at Roper but not digitized. And so it's just been sitting there, and somebody just got an NSF grant to go through all these surveys and make them available online, which will be great. I want to get this book done and out first, but then it will be great for everybody else because you could just download it and do the analysis. But I couldn't find a single paper that used this data since 1951. So nobody does this, and you can imagine my reaction when I saw the code book and was reading through, and they said, "Do you think you'll get rights?" And I'm like, "Wow, that is something." So just a good piece of luck. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank
and
you.
fun to talk.